Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott. Sony's mirrorless E-mount has reached a saturation point where there are more lenses available on it than possibly any lens mount ever before. So finding a truly unique lens in 2025 can be difficult to do. That is not true for today's review, however, as Sony is releasing what is a truly genre-busting lens that builds on the foundation that was set by last year's 28 to 70mm f2 G Master lens. And in this case, we have got a new 50 to 150 f2 G Master. And so it goes from normal to telephoto while maintaining a constant maximum aperture. That makes it a lens that the world has never seen before on full frame. But just know that you're going to have to pay for the privilege of ownership. The price tag is going to be around $3,900 US or about $5,500 here in Canada. So is this new beast worth that kind of money? Well, let's dive in and let's find out. I want to thank Sony USA for sending me a loaner of this lens. Sony has had no input on this video and will not be previewing it before it is released to you, the viewing public. And so all of the opinions here are my own. Let's talk about the build and handling here. The kind of design from Sony is the idea that this is a lens that can replace a number of other primes. That fast maximum aperture means that it can replace everything from a 50 to 135mm prime lens and a bit more. And the truth of the matter is that right now, outside of 135mm, where we have some f1.8 lenses, this is actually the fastest maximum aperture of any autofocus lens that I'm aware of after 135mm. There is no 200mm f2, for example, on Sony, at least at this point. And so that means that 150mm and f2, that's the fastest glass that we have got here on FE. Now, the chief competitor is going to be this lens right here, which I reviewed back in 2021, and it's a lens that is kind of my go-to. If I could have only one lens, it would be this one. And that's the Tamron 35 to 150mm f2 to f2.8 VXD. It's a fantastic lens, and it does have a brighter aperture range than what most competing lenses have had before, and it was similarly very much a genre-boosting kind of lens, or busting kind of lens. That being said, this lens is f2.2 by 50mm, and so it's never actually as bright as what this lens is at any point. And by 85mm, it is closed down to a maximum aperture of just f2.8, which of course is similar to a whole variety of other zoom lenses. And so that really sets the G Master apart in that regard. Now, as you can see, this isn't a small lens. It is 102.8mm in diameter, or a little over 4 inches. And that's probably the single most unique factor here, because the truth of the matter is at 200mm in length, or 7.87 inches, it's actually the same length as the 70 to 200mm f2.8 G Master Mark II lens. But it is obviously more significant in diameter. So that means that up front we end up with a much larger filter size than the 70 to 200 GM Mark II. We've got a 95mm front filter thread, and so that means that filters are going to be kind of expensive for this. But obviously this is a lens, because of that fast maximum aperture, that you may end up using filters on. And so for that reason, in the lens hood, we have got a door that will allow you to rotate either a circular polarizer or maybe a variable ND filter. And as you can see, the actual lens hood itself is actually fairly shallow. So I don't know if it was entirely necessary, but the advantage of a door that you don't always get with putting a finger in is if the filter doesn't have a lot of room outside of it to get a finger on, the window allows you to just get at the little knurled side edges of it and do that rotation. And so probably useful in that regard. The lens is heavy, but it's not unusually so. It weighs in at 1,340 grams, or a little over 47 ounces. Now, to give you some perspective, that is definitely heavier than the GM Mark II 70 to 200, which is 1,045 grams, or 295 grams less. However, the first generation 70 to 200 G Master lens actually weighed considerably more, 1,480 grams. And so in this case, that's 140 grams heavier. The Tamron, just for reference, is 1,165 grams, and so it is essentially right under 200 grams less than what this lens is. Now, One other factor that comes into play, however, is that weight is without the tripod foot attached. And I put the foot itself on my scale, and it weighs in at an additional 80 grams. And so that will boost the weight up a little bit higher. Now that foot is very easy to remove. There's a tension knob that you loosen here on the side, and then a button you depress at the front, and then you can just slide it off like that. And of course, obviously, you just reverse that process if you want to mount it back. And so very easy to remove. And certainly when I was shooting handheld, I did eliminate the tripod foot because it just didn't seem to be something that was necessary there. I do have one complaint about the foot, and that is that it continues, all of Sony's tripod feet are not Arca compatible. And so as you can see here, I have had to add on a quick release plate, and so I can go to a tripod. I obviously prefer to have tripod feet that have the grooves for Arca, and so you can go right onto a tripod without having to mess with putting on the quick release plate. There's a tension knob here on the side that if you loosen, you can freely rotate it on the tripod collar. There are no detents at the cardinal positions. However, there are alignment dots, and so you can easily line those up and lock into the position if you're wanting to be at one of those cardinal positions. Now, because this is a constant aperture lens, it means that we can have a traditional approach to aperture control. And so that means on a G Master lens that you have either the ability to have clicks at 1/3 stop detents all the way through from f2 to f22. And then there is a fixed stop between f22 and the automatic position. However, you do have an iris lock here on the left side that will allow you to either lock into or out of the manual aperture ring, depending on what your preference is. If you like to control from within camera, put it in the automatic mode and then lock it there, and you don't even have to worry about the aperture ring. If you want to just use the aperture ring, do the exact opposite. You also, on the right side, have the ability to declick the aperture, and so you can rack through it in just one smooth motion. And that has the greatest benefit of that is the ability to do aperture racking. And as you can see, it works as it should. I can rack through all of those aperture options without any kind of visible steps along the way, which is exactly how I want it to function. In the middle of the lens and between the two rings, we have got a bank here with a couple of switches. There's an AF/MF switch, always welcome, and then an on-off switch for the full-time direct manual focus. And so if you have that enabled, even if you don't have a camera that natively supports a DMF during AFC mode, it should function with this. On both of my cameras, that's the way it works. And so you can just override focus at any point. Also, in 3 different positions, on the bottom, that left side, and then on the top, there are custom buttons, function or focus hold buttons. Now, all of those are redundant, and so it's not 3 different functions applied there, but it's going to be a single function that you designate from within the camera, and so they're repeated, and so whatever orientation you happen to be shooting in, there should be one close by to your thumb, and so that you can easily use it. Now, one of the great advantages of this particular design over a lens like the Tamron is that the Tamron is an externally zooming lens, whereas this is an internally zooming lens. And so that means that you can change your zooming position much quicker, much easier, and much smoother. And as you can see here, I was able to zoom in and out during shooting video handheld, something I don't think I could actually do with the Tamron with any kind of smoothness. I did note that in that zoom ring that there is a rotation of about 80 degrees. I'd actually prefer it to be a little bit less than that, maybe 65 degrees. I just find it's a little bit long for just a single wrist rotation. And so I would like to shorten that up a bit more. I really love the action on, for example, the 200 to 600 millimeter G lens, which has a really nice quick, and so you can zoom in and out. But the fact that you can do those quick zoom changes does open up some extra types of photography that you can do effectively with this lens, which maybe we'll dive in a little bit more in the autofocus section. Up front is the manual focus ring, and the damping is decent on it. It does move in a linear fashion, and so you can get a certain degree of repeatability for manual focus pulls. I will say, however, that its position is a little bit far forward for my taste, and I find that when I'm in the camera or holding the camera, I don't naturally reach all that way forward to get to that manual focus ring. However, like anything, you can develop the muscle memory simply by doing it. As you would expect in a high-end GM lens, there is a thorough weather sealing. There's a gasket at the lens mount, flooring coating on the front element, and then seals at all the different dials and switches and rings along the way. It's designed to use in adverse conditions, and the fact, of course, that it's internally zooming makes that even easier to keep sealed and to keep dust and moisture out of it. And so that's fantastic. I do have one critique here at the back, however, and that is that there is an element that is right near the rear lens mount, and so you know what that means. No teleconverters. And frankly, I don't feel like modern lens makers take enough heat over this. It seems like in the mirrorless world, far too often teleconverters are an afterthought or not a thought at all. And a lens like this, to me, is kind of screaming to have that teleconverter compatibility that would allow you to get up to 210 millimeters at just f2.8, or with the 2 times up to 300 millimeters at f4. That obviously would add a lot of versatility to the lens, and I think it's a shame that Sony did not make this compatible with teleconverters, even if it meant making the design just a little bit larger. Now, as with many modern zooms, you have 2 different minimum focus distances. On the wide end, you can go as closely as 40 centimeters, and then on the telephoto end, you can go as closely as 74 centimeters. I think technically the higher magnification of 0.20 times is found on the 50 millimeter or wide end, but as you can see here, they are so close that there's not really a lot of space that I can see to discern between the two. I did feel like that the up-close performance was maybe a little bit better at 50 millimeters. However, at 150 millimeters, you get a much better working distance, and you also get a flatter plane of focus. So for me, I probably in real world shooting would end up shooting at the 150 millimeter end a bit more, because I just think that that's a more practical approach out in the field. However, I certainly appreciate the fact that it does have a decent level of magnification, and that is a little bit higher than what we find on the Tamron lens. Inside the aperture iris, there are 11 rounded blades, and as you can see, if we go back to this aperture rack clip, you can see that it does a fantastic job of maintaining a very circular shape without showing you the shape of the aperture blades as you stop it down. Now, another unfortunate omission is that there is no lens-based stabilization in this lens, no OSS, so that means you're going to be relying on the stabilization in your camera. Sony's IBIS, depending on the camera body, obviously there's some variability, but something that I found fairly consistently is that with telephoto focal lengths, it's just not as good. And so I do miss OSS here. I feel like the in-body image stabilization does a decent but not exceptional job. Not as good as what I think you would get if you had some lens-based stabilization. However, no use crying over spilt milk. It's not here. Of course, it's not on the Tamron either. And so again, there's parity in that regard. Overall, however, this is a lens that oozes quality in its overall build. It feels like a very high-end lens. In fact, the build, in many ways, it feels like what you might expect from one of their $10,000, super telephoto primes. It's that high of level, and it really is a gorgeous lens. So let's talk autofocus. This is something that I think Sony is doing better than anybody else, bar none at this point. They've got 4 of their XD linear motors, and autofocus is essentially instantaneous, both to acquire and then effortless in which to track. It is perfect for high-speed, high-performance tracking. And that opens up another possibility here. I think that this lens, maybe even beyond as a portrait lens, which people might naturally think of it as, I think that it could be an amazing sports lens, particularly for something like court sports, basketball, tennis, something similar to that. We were working a little bit of a smaller space, not a stadium, but a smaller space, and the ability to quickly zoom in and out for your framing and an f2 aperture. It could be a groundbreaking lens for that kind of use. Obviously also as a reportage lens or event lens, wedding lens. There's a lot of great applications that come when you have top-notch autofocus, and it is top-notch. Even in rather dim light and the fact that Nala blends in very nicely, you can see that from the very first shot, focus instantly acquired her and tracked her perfectly throughout all of these sequences, and I could look at every single one of them and they were all just nailed right on her eye, even though she was moving at a fast pace and I was shooting at 30 frames per second on my Alpha 1. Very, very impressive. In fact, this lens is set up to support up to 120 frames per second on the A9 Mark III. They say it's rated for shooting at 240 frames per second video. And while I didn't shoot 240, I did shoot some 120 4K footage, and focus was flawless through it. It was also flawless for portrait work in general. Even though I intentionally shot through layers to give a different look and a more shallow depth of field, you can just see that focus was nailed every time, and it just instantly acquired proper focus, and there was not one missed shot. It was all perfect. And so autofocus here is just really, really amazing. You couldn't ask for a better autofocus system, and the fact that this is such an extreme lens that's never been done before and comes with flawless autofocus, that's huge. And I think that Sony definitely deserves commendation on that front. Same is true on the video side of things. I found that while focus pulls at 50 millimeters felt a little bit better, a little tighter, quicker, better damped, even at 150 millimeters f2, which is very challenging, they did a great job. And you can see that it still is moving at a good pace back and forth and a good degree of confidence. You can also see in these tests that at 50 millimeters, I could not see any focus breathing at all, even with compensation turned off. And then at 150 millimeters, there's only the tiniest amount of focus breathing, even without that compensation turned on. And so if you turn the compensation on, and the fact that it does get that support as a first-party Sony lens, it means that it would be just the tiniest of crop, and it could eliminate that perfectly at that point. So that is obviously huge. The lens had no problem, didn't expect it would, in my hand test, going from my hand to my eye and back forth. And then, of course, as referred to previously, I did shoot some 4K 120 video, and even as I zoomed in and out, it was flawless. It just focus stayed where it needed to do, and even shooting at a high frame rate and high resolution, I had zero problems. And so this is also going to be a great lens for some that want it for video production. Again, because it does something unique and different. It gives you that shallow depth of field at 150 millimeters that you're just not going to get with any other lens that exists here at the moment. So autofocus is absolutely top notch. I don't think that I've ever seen better. So how about the image quality? This is an optical design of 19 elements in 17 groups, and as you can imagine, it's complex, and there are a lot of exotic elements there. There's 2 extreme aspherical elements, 2 regular aspherical elements, 3 extra low dispersion elements, 2 super extra low dispersion elements, so a lot of fancy glass that's a part of that design. Unfortunately, getting the lens when I did, there was not any kind of pre-release MTF charts available, so I can't show you the optical design or the MTF chart, but suffice it to say the MTF chart would look fantastic because the lens sharpness and contrast is fantastic. Though this is a zoom lens that covers a lot of different focal lengths, it has very, very minor barrel distortion on the wide end. I used a +8 to correct for that. In the middle of the range, it becomes a mild pincushion distortion, a -4 that I used to correct there. And then at the extreme telephoto end, it was just slightly more pincushion at a -6. All of that was very linear and easy to manually correct. And of course, as a first-party Sony lens, it will receive full profile corrections, both in camera and then in software. Vignette is extremely low. Again, surprising for an f2 zoom, but I saw almost no vignette. I mean, you might dial in a stop at most on my test chart. That's what I could see, but in real world shots, that's just so minimal that I saw nothing to correct for. And I'm reminded that, Sigma did do, a long time ago, did an APS-C 50 to 100 millimeter f2 zoom, which was groundbreaking at that point. But it was, fairly heavy vignette. And so it's really impressive what they've managed to do optically with this lens. I also saw very little chromatic aberrations. On my test chart, you can see that either at 50 or 150 millimeters, there's very, very little to see. And when I shot something like the vintage cameras that I like to shoot that often will show on shiny surfaces or, in the transition from etched letters onto a black lens barrel, a lot of times you'll see fringing in those situations. And I did see a tiny, tiny bit of it, but nothing much. I didn't see any fringing around specular highlights. All of that was very, very good. I saw no lateral style chromatic aberrations near the edge of the frame either. So fringing is just not an issue overall. Looking at the sharpness and if you want a deeper dive into the optics, I will do that at the end of the video. But to give you an overview here, the lens is very sharp and very high contrast, even at f2 at 50 millimeters. Great in the center, great in the mid frame, a little bit of a drop off into the corners, but still very, very good. In fact, if I went back and compared to the Tamron is not quite as good in the center of the frame, but more competitive there. In the corners, this would be at 35 millimeters f2 versus 50 millimeters f2, but in the corners, the Tamron is very obviously weaker than what the Sony is. It's very well corrected, very consistent in that regard. You'll see those corners sharpen up a bit by f2.8 and then more obviously by f5.6, where it's essentially flawless all across the frame. Landscape images, as you might imagine, at 50 millimeters are excellent. High detail, high contrast, good color, all the things that you might want. Diffraction will start to set in at about f11 on my 61 megapixel camera, and so after that, you'll find that at f16 and more noticeably at f22, minimum aperture, that it becomes increasingly soft due to diffraction. Moving on throughout the zoom range, there are 4 marked positions, 50, 70, 100, and 150 millimeters. So at 70 millimeters, I found that contrast increased, detail did not, but contrast increased at 70 millimeters versus 50 millimeters. Real world shot at 70 millimeters looks great, as you might expect. At 100 millimeters, I found that there was a little less contrast than at 70 millimeters, but more detail being resolved, and the corners look maybe the best that I have seen to this point throughout the zoom range, wide open at f2. And so obviously if you stop down 100 millimeters a bit, it gets ridiculously sharp. But even at f2, like of this shot of my new great nephew here, that you can see that it's beautiful. I mean, beautifully sharp around the eye. Depth of field, of course, is tiny at 100 millimeters f2, but really, really gorgeous end results there. Moving on to 150 millimeters sees kind of more similar to the 70 millimeter performance, with detail is not picked up, but contrast has. And so when I went back and compared to the Tamron at 150 millimeters, Tamron being at f2.8 at that point, obviously, again, it was kind of a same pattern to at 50 millimeters. It was the Sony lens is a bit sharper in the center of the frame, and in the corners also sharper, though not by maybe as much of a margin as it was at 50 millimeters. But I mean, I've always thought the Tamron to be fantastic for a lens like this, so you know, Sony is even better at that point. If there is a fly in the ointment for all of this amazing optical performance, it's that, much like the way I felt about the 85 millimeter f1.4 GM Mark II, that it's incredible when it comes to detail, micro contrast, all of those things. But I felt the rendering was only good but not great. And I kind of feel the same way here, that you know, if I went and shot some of the same shots with the Tamron versus the GM, and I will do a subsequent video where I kind of dive a little bit deeper into the head-to-head stuff, but I did find that I felt like I preferred the rendering from the Tamron a bit more. And so something about some of when you have a background completely blurred out, obviously it's really, really soft. But if things are in the transition zone on the Sony, I feel like they get a little bit more outlining and get a little bit busier than what I would like. And so this is a lens that looks great in favorable settings, but you know, transition areas can get a little bit busy. And so I don't think that that's necessarily the pinnacle of its performance relative to the sharpness. I feel like if there's a pendulum, it's swung towards the sharpness and contrast, not towards the rendering. One other surprising thing that I encountered is that while at 50 millimeters, there is some flare issues, some minor ghosting, nothing extreme there, and the sun star looks pretty good. But if you zoom into 150 millimeters and you pan across the sun or get the sun in or right out of the frame, there's a surprising amount of flare, mostly in the ghosting pattern, that intensifies as you stop the lens down. I knocked the Tamron for the same thing, and I know that Sony's coatings are great, and for that matter, Tamron's B-Bar 2 coatings are also great. So that may just be one of the challenges in engineering a lens that has a focal length and a faster maximum aperture like this. But that's not what I would consider a strength. So if you're shooting on the 150 millimeter end and you're shooting into a backlit situation for portraits or something like that, just be careful because that may be something you would have to avoid. So my conclusion is this. This is, as mentioned, the first lens of its kind. However, it's far too mature to feel like a first effort. This is not a lens that you look at and say, oh, you know, it's okay, but as soon as the Mark II version comes, it's going to be a whole lot better. No, this is definitely a high-end performance. It oozes premium quality. The moment I took it out of the box and just kind of looked at it, it's like, wow, you know, that's a special lens. And it certainly is that. It comes with this nice padded case, zippered case to put it in. It's got a lens hood that's got that rubberized, you know, front transition. It's got the fancy paint and finish on it. That means it's going to be a beautiful lens that looks like a professional lens a decade from now. I would have gone into this review saying that it's going to be a top choice for events and portrait work, you know, weddings. And I think that that is true, but I actually think that the true top application for this lens is really going to be for those that are shooting sports. I think you need a little less of the artistic part and more of the technical part that this lens excels in. And that incredible autofocus means that this is a lens that's going to do things that you couldn't do with other lenses before. And I think it's amazing for that. I think it will be a great wedding and event lens, being able to shoot in, you know, dimmer venues and to have, you know, that quick zoom action, to have an f2 maximum aperture, amazing sharpness, and the autofocus that's just going to nail it in dim lighting conditions. That's going to be, you know, that could make all the difference in certain shooting situations. So I think that's also a great application. If you're purely a portrait photographer, of course, it's your money and your mileage may vary, but I feel like maybe this lens in terms of its cost is overkill for that setting. I feel like there wasn't a lot that I couldn't do with a good 85mm f1.4 lens, you know, if I could zoom a little bit with my feet. And so I don't know if it's as necessary for that, but certainly, you know, if you're in space constrained situations to where being able to zoom in and out is going to make all the difference, well, absolutely knock yourself out. This is a very expensive lens at, you know, $3,900 US, but it feels elite. And if you're someone who needs the best, well, you've got something else to spend your money on. If you want more information, you can check out my full text review that's linked in the description down below. And there are some buying links there as well that will be populated throughout the day. And if you want that deeper look at the optical performance, stay tuned with me right now and we'll jump into that together. Okay, so this gives you an idea of what we're looking at between 50 and then 150 millimeters. You can see that that is a tremendously different amount of framing. So it's obviously going to give you a lot of options for portrait events, sports, whatever work you're going to be doing. That's an extremely useful focal range 3x zoom ratio. Now at 50 millimeters, we have a very mild amount of barrel distortion. I used about a +7 in that range to correct for it. You can see it's very linear, correct easily. There's only a minimal amount of vignette in the corners, very easy to correct, about a stop there in the +30 range. Middle of the zoom range turns to a bit of pincushion distortion. Here I've used a -4 to correct that mild amount. Again, you can see it's very linear, corrects easily. Vignette again is just really not much of an issue at all. Pincushion distortion increases a bit at 150 millimeters, and so in this case I needed to use a -6 to correct. But again, you can see very linear, corrects easily, and again, vignette is remaining at a very nice level. The shot at 100 millimeters, for example, has 0 correction for vignette. You can see all of the corners that should be bright. They are naturally bright, no issue there, and so that's definitely a strength for the lens. Now, in terms of longitudinal style chromatic aberrations, you can see here in this transition area, which really tends to show the stuff up, there's a very, very mild amount, just a tiny bit of fringing there. I don't really see anything on the edge of specular highlights, and so all of that is handled pretty well. On the test chart, you can see at 50 millimeters, there's a bit of it there, and then at 150 millimeters, it's a little less pronounced. And so you're going to see more of it on the wide end than what you do on the telephoto. Lateral style chromatic aberrations, no problem. I see no fringing in the transitions from black to white near the edge of the frame. Now I'm going to reserve comparisons with the Tamron for that head-to-head video, so I'm just going to focus on the optical quality here. This is 200% magnification on a 61 megapixel sensor. Middle of the frame looks fantastic. Great contrast, great detail. Mid-frame also looks very, very good. You know, a little bit softer than the center, but still holding up very strong. There's not a lot of drop-off from here to here, and as we look into the corner, we can see that the corner, although it's softer, it still is very good. And if we look over on this side and then into the upper left and then finally upper right corners, we see good centering, good consistency throughout. If we go back to that upper left corner, you can see stopping down to f2.8 increases contrast, and so the brights look a little bit brighter. You can just see that there's more detail popping there. We stop on down to f5.6, and you can see those corners are now really, really sharp. And so this is a very consistent performance all across the frame. Great detail right off to the very edge at f5.6. Basically, f4 through f8 is going to be exceptionally good. At f11, you're going to get a little bit of softening due to diffraction. If you stop on down to f16 and then particularly to f22, you'll definitely see things get considerably softer due to the effects of diffraction. Now at 70 millimeters, you can see that there's tons of contrast. You can see that from the moire pattern that begins to set up there. As you stop down to f2.8, you can see that there's just a little bit more detailed rendered. The darks are getting a little bit darker. The brights are getting a little bit brighter. Mid-frame here looks really excellent, particularly by f2.8. That detail is just popping there. And if we pop back up to this corner, you can see that it's looking really, really fantastic right up into the corners as well. At 100 millimeters, we can see that there is a little bit less contrast in the middle of the frame. Detail is still looking really good. Stopping down to f2.8 does start to increase that contrast once again. We see a nice even performance here. It's still looking good in the mid-frame, and it stopped down, obviously. And into the corners are actually looking really, really strong. And so it's just a little bit different distribution of sharpness at 100 millimeters versus 70 millimeters, but still extremely sharp. Finally, at 150 millimeters at f2, it looks sharp and high contrast, very much what it looked like what I saw at 70 millimeters, and the same kind of pattern that as you stop it down, it just intensifies a bit more. I don't think that the detail is quite as good, but it is very, very close, and it's also very consistent once again. Mid-frame looks very good. Up into the corners are looking good, and again, we'll just pop around the world. You can see a good centering performance, good consistency. Wherever we're looking across the frame, it's holding up very nicely. Give you a real-world shot at 150 millimeters so you can see the combination of sharpness and contrast, and then also the rendering that's going on in the image. Nice-looking image. Now we can see the difference in the minimum focus distance. In terms of that magnification that comes out at 50 millimeters versus 150 millimeters, there is very slightly higher at 50 millimeters versus 150 millimeters. This is probably more like either 1.8 or 1.9 times compared to 0.20 times. However, there's a couple of other things I see. First of all, I see at 50 millimeters that contrast is better, and so it gives you a little bit better up-close performance. However, if we step back just a bit, we can see also that you're getting maybe a little bit flatter plane of focus at 150 millimeters. And so, it's neither one of them is bad, neither one of them is exceptionally different. Here again, showing you 50 and then 150 millimeters at minimum focus. What's going to really change is the amount of compression to the background, and so it just gives you an idea of the rendering if you're using the up close versus the distant. I tend to kind of favor the distant more for the working distance. It just means you're a little bit further away and you're not going to shade your subject. Now, the bokeh in rendering is very situational, in my opinion. In a shot like this, obviously, you're going to get a tiny, tiny little sliver of depth of field. The background's strongly defocused. It looks fantastic. This image here, it's a similar kind of situation. It's a very favorable situation. You can see that the contrast and the detail pops. The background is smooth. And in this image, this is an image that I actually thought would end up looking better than what it did, but because there are some harder edges in the background, it gets a little bit busier there. Just doesn't render that quite as special as it did with the other. Now, one thing it does do very well is that while there's some kind of odd clipping and deformation here towards the corners, it does do a fantastic job of maintaining a circular shape, and you don't ever see the aperture blades really ever at any point. And so you're able to get very nice and round specular highlights. And so kind of in a mathematical way, the bokeh is good. It's just that kind of more artistic rendering that I think it lacks a bit. Now, when it comes to portrait work here, detail is great, as you would expect. The rendering, as you can see, it's, there's pretty nice three-dimensional cutout, but you can see just in some of these areas, it gets a little bit jittery in the rendering. Here, more of a head and shoulders type shot. This is shot at f2.8. You can see it looks fantastic. Skin tones are nice. The background, I think there's just a little bit more outlining. This image I like, but this background being a little bit more complex, particularly on the left side of the frame, makes it just doesn't render it as nicely as an easier that's here on the right side of the frame.
Here's some layering, and I thought that it did good with the foreground bokeh, and I was intentionally really shooting through things to try to create that natural frame. Detail looks great. You can see again in this area, it doesn't like that kind of stuff, but all of this looks good. Likewise in this shot, more of the natural frame, although in this area there's just a little bit more hard edging than what I would like. In this shot, it's a very neutral background, so there's it's just kind of furniture inside of a house. All of that just kind of melts away, and I think the bokeh looks great there, and the detail obviously looks fantastic. Look at those eyes and all of those little fine hairs that are there, and the eyelashes, really, really beautiful. So my opinion is that the bokeh is good, and it's going to look really good if you put it in the right situation. If you put it in a more complex situation, it's not as happy. The flare resistance I was surprised by, considering how good Sony's coatings are. I think the sunburst looks pretty good, and 50 millimeters wasn't as bad as we saw with the video, but at 150 millimeters, you're definitely going to see lots of ghosting artifacts, and that's going to become more obvious if you stop the lens down. So you're going to have to be careful in your composition and make sure that you don't ruin images through that. So that's an area where the lens does fall a little bit flat, in my opinion. Overall, a very nice optical performance, as you would expect from a premium lens from Sony.
So thanks for sticking around to the very end, and I hope that this has helped you to get a more informed opinion as to whether or not this is a lens for you. As always, thanks for watching, have a great day, and let the light in.